The person that you see and experience when dealing with narcissists isn't really a person at all. What does that mean? I mean, there's a human being there. There's a body, right? They're talking, they're expressing ideas, they're expressing feelings, emotions, motives. But what there is to understand is that what you're experiencing is what's called a false self. What is a false self? Well, a false self is an emulated being. What does emulated being mean? It means that the behaviors, the apparent emotional expressions, the philosophies, the motives, the intentions, the thoughts, the ideations, the wants, the desires, these are all emulations. What is an emulation? Well, an emulation would be a copy of, a replication of. You see, when you're talking about a narcissist and you're talking about a personality disorder, in this instance, you're talking about somebody that doesn't have a personality. There's no personality. You see, as you get to know a human being, you observe the behaviors, you feel things, you hear things. You start to get an idea of their philosophy. You're starting to get an idea of their view of life. You're starting to get an idea for their desires, what inspires them, what they're motivated by, what they fear, what their vulnerabilities are, what their strengths are. You're learning about their personality, their traits, their characteristics, their character. You see, and then you really get a sense of knowing that person. And there's some predictability there, right? That's the thing with narcissists, is you can't know them. There's nothing to know, because underneath the emulated behaviors, there's nothing. And the emulated behaviors do not point to anything. That they don't embody an underlying being, that there is nothing underneath them. They're empty. And what I mean by empty is that the behaviors, whether they're happy, whether they're upset, whether they're acting entitled, whether they're operating in denial, whether they're rejecting something, whether they're excited about something, when they express an opinion, when they're passionately in defense of a perspective, when they're telling you their worldview and philosophy, that none of that means anything. That there isn't a core to this individual. That all of that stuff is catered to the moment. It is catered to a semblance of awareness of that individual. And those are strategic emulations that are meant to help sustain the underlying false self that those emulated behaviors are modeled to be consistent with. And they are meant to get supply, acknowledgement, in an effort to help sustain and solidify the false self. That narcissistic supply is a necessary component for the maintenance of the false self. And so if they are a vulnerable narcissist, they need to experience victimhood. They need to experience, reactive abuse. They need to generate conflict. They also need to experience empathy, sympathy for their victimhood. If they are a grandiose narcissist, they need to experience admiration. They need to experience respect. They need engagement. They need to experience being important, more important than other people, in order to validate, verify, and solidify the false reality and narratives surrounding and suspending into existence the false self. And these mechanisms are required as an alternate to a personality. So when we talk about the alternate to a personality, what we're saying is that these people did not develop a personality. Highly likely that they were traumatized prior to it. And so these ways of being that are developed in personality that create rigid structures that are consistent for people, that are defining for people, that help form the worldview of people and help carry them through time as a consistent being experiencing itself through the lens of personality. Narcissists don't have those dynamics. So they don't have any permanence when it comes to consistently remaining the same way. That they, in a sense, have impermanence with their identity and therefore require ongoing maintenance, ongoing effort, ongoing validation, ongoing verification. That the whole basis of engaging with other beings is to exist because we need a way of modeling reality in order to survive it. And so the number one rule of life is survival. And so the false self is the alternate strategy for merely causing survival. And the false self is an entity that is itself attempting to remain in existence at all costs. At all costs. Against all odds, a makeshift reality that is often opposed to reality itself without merit. A need to deny reality in order to preserve their reality. And so when they act out in pathological ways, hurt people, betray people, use people, cheat on people, steal from people, what do they have to do? They cannot acknowledge it. Because they feel guilt and shame? No, because it's inconsistent with the false reality and will start to cause an erosion or damage to the false reality. And if enough damage happens to a false reality, that false reality caves in around the narcissist. That their whole world, their identity, what it is that they created themselves to be, will be destroyed, obliterated. And the person that they were experiencing themselves as will cease to exist. That a mortification event requires the genesis and manufacturing of a new false entity. And often that new false entity is going to be an improved one. That they experienced a mortification, they experienced a very traumatic life event that caused them to fully collapse, and they cannot allow that to happen again because the whole purpose of the false entity is to protect that being, to have it work in avoidance of its own internal core that has been deeply traumatized and damaged, to avoid the pain that's already there, and to merely survive. But you see, the survival of the false entity is the preservation of it as a necessary component of identity, a necessary component of cognition, a necessary component of modeling an interpreted view of reality to enable the survival of the human being. That is the whole purpose of our psychology in a universal sense, that your psychology and your personality are structures that enable your interpretation of life and your survival of an interpreted life to keep the human race moving forward and existing at all. But make no mistake, there is nothing underneath the false self.